হ্যাঁ, লাইভ শুরু হয়েছে। মনে হচ্ছে স্যার এখন মানে স্যারকে ওই
রাইট,
ওয়েলকাম
আমরা
স্পিচটা
লাইভ
দিতে হবে
আছি।
নাকি?
আমি প্রথমে শুরু করে নিই, তারপরে আমি স্যারকে বলছি।
ওকে।
Good afternoon, everyone. It gives us great pleasure to welcome all of you to this international webinar on gender issues and women's rights. This is being organized by the internal quality assurance cells of two colleges, Acharya Sukumar Sen Mahavidyalaya, Purba Bardhaman, and Birpara College, Alipurduar. We have had more than 2,500 registered participants for this webinar. So it would have been impossible to include or accommodate all of them on any online platform, which is why we are streaming the sessions live on YouTube. And for that, we are particularly grateful to the educational and cultural station of Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir, Belur, for giving us this platform. I first invite Dr. Jayanto Mukherjee, the principal of Acharya Sukumar Sen Mahavidyalaya, to give the welcome address. ওনার উৎসাহ এবং সাহায্য ছাড়া এই ওয়েবিনারটা আমরা কোনোভাবেই অর্গানাইজ করতে পারতাম না। ডক্টর মুখার্জি, আপনি যদি ওয়েলকাম অ্যাড্রেসটা দেন, ধন্যবাদ।
Thank you, Nikhilesh. Good afternoon, everybody. I, on behalf of the organizing committee of this international webinar on gender issues and women's rights, jointly conducted by Acharya Sukumar Sen Mahavidyalaya, Purba Bardhaman, and Birpara College, Alipurduar, welcome you all. First of all, it's my proud privilege to welcome our international speaker, Gabriela Ilieva from New York University. Thank you, ma'am, for your gracious presence. I heartily welcome Professor Nilanjana Gupta, Department of English from Jadavpur University. Thank you, ma'am, for your participation in our international webinar. We have with us Dr. Sneha Korchaudhuri from West Bengal State University. Welcome, ma'am. We welcome Mrs. Viveka Gurung from Nor Bahadur Bhandari Degree College, Sikkim, and Mrs. Noor Rizvi from Aligarh Muslim University. Thank you all. Now, let us say why we have selected such a fantastic topic, gender issues and women's rights, in today's perspective. You know, every day in every country in the world, women are confronted by discrimination and inequality. They face violence, abuse, and unequal treatment at home, at work, and in their wider communities, and are denied opportunities to learn, to earn, and to live. Gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. But women have fewer resources, less power, and less influence compared to men, and experience further inequality because of their class, ethnicity, and age, as well as religions and other fundamental issues. If we go through gender inequality in numbers, we see women make up less than 24% of the world's parliamentarians and 5% of its mayors. On an average, women are paid 24% less than men in comparable works. Nearly two-thirds of the world's 781 million illiterate adults are women for last 2 decades. And 153 countries in the world have laws which discriminate against women economically. And you know, 1 in 3 women experience violence or abuse worldwide in their lifetime. Here lies our responsibilities. We can support women's access to resources, equal opportunities to receive jobs, and equal choice to work their way out of poverty. We can support women in their efforts to take part in decision making at all levels and promote leadership and participation of women. We have to raise voice to stop violence against women. We hope equal job opportunities, equal health care and education, equal decision-making power, and freedom from violence can make the change. Institutions like us need to address their needs and interests. Once again, I heartily welcome you all in this 2-day-long international webinar and hand over the microphone for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for your welcome address. Our first speaker today is Professor Nilanjana Gupta from the Department of English, Jadavpur University. She has been teaching there since 1991 and has served as the director of the School of Media Communication and Culture and as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. Her interests are in urban studies, media and cultural studies, and sociology of education. The title of her presentation today is Why Do We Need to Talk About Women's Rights Today? Her presentation will be followed by a question and answer session before we move on to today's second presentation. So please, all participants, write your questions in the chat box after you or while you hear Professor Gupta speak. Over to Professor Nilanjana Gupta. Thank you for being part of this.
Thank you, Nikhilesh, and all the other organizers of this webinar. This is, of course, a new format for all of us, and I don't think, being of an older generation, I don't think I've been able to transit from the traditional modes of seminar into these digital modes, but I guess we still have to all learn and adjust with the new normal, as we are calling it. I think that it's very important that we are discussing these kind of issues today. And I think that it is very, very imperative, as the principal, Dr. Mukherjee, pointed out, that we need to look at a lot of the issues and we need to think about what we are going to do to change the situation that we have around us. On the one hand, if we have the first slide on the just the sort of title slide, that why do we need to talk about women's rights at all right now? And when I was talking to Nikhilesh, who is, of course, like others here as well, used to be a student of mine. So when we were discussing this, I was wondering what exactly I could say here today. And eventually we sort of agreed on a very broad-based introductory kind of thing to the whole discussion over 2 days. And I wanted to start off with the idea that Indian women in the last few years have really made a name for themselves. And just to look at a few, if we can see some of the images, Nikhilesh, that the first image is a very famous image when last year India ISRO launched the Chandrayaan-2. And this was one of the photographs. There were many photographs which were circulating not only in the national press, but in the international press as well, where the number of women in the team, in the ISRO team, was commented on by the New York Times, Washington Post, and of course a lot of news media in India as well. And we probably know that the mission director was also Dr. Ritu Karidhal, and there were many women in this team in senior positions in this entire team that actually was responsible for the launch of this fantastic technological and scientific project that India government had taken on. And then if we carry, so I mean, there were a lot of articles all over the world about how many Indian women scientists there are who are working at such a demanding level. And if any of you watch science fiction, there's actually I think it's on Amazon Prime, there's a series going on right now called Expanse, And one of the few women characters there is an Indian woman scientist wearing a sari and lovely earrings, and being very Indian, though she's not played by an Indian actress. But this whole idea of the Indian woman scientist, which we find in Arthur C. Clarke's work as well, is something that has been commented on. If we move on, we see that not only in science, but recently women sports persons have made a much greater impact in the international arena than many of their male counterparts, apart from cricket, of course. But we find so many of these women who are competing at the global level, who are winning, who are as we see, and we're constantly told, making our nation proud. If we move on to the business sphere, we see the chairperson of the global company of Pepsi, not just the Indian company, but she's now the global CEO of the Pepsi. And in India, of course, we all have seen many images of Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, who's one of the very important, influential entrepreneurs in India. So can we just see that as well before moving on to the next slide? So when we're looking at these women, definitely they are all women who have achieved, who have reached, a great height in their own chosen professions. But what is being said about these women? If we move to the next slide, this is an online news portal. It's a little bit cut at the bottom, but it's an online news portal, and I think you can read what it says. That it is talking about the number of women who are heading corporate companies and banks and so on in India. And it's saying that, I think very importantly, pardon the English, I've just taken it from the website. So it says that society was dominated by males, but women are breaking the trend and coming out of the shadows in an all-powerful avatar. And that they are making nation feel proud and being influential to other women of India and globe. So these women are being held up as kind of role models for all of us to follow. And we are told that just positive belief and confidence could lead you to a remarkable journey. Now, this is, I think, the important point from which I want to take off today. That no, it is not just about positive belief and confidence for women to be able to succeed today in India and possibly in other places in the world as well. It is not about individual women's potential and confidence and belief. It is not just about achieving as a woman, as an individual. But I think the more important issue is about dismantling, destroying, and changing the structure of patriarchy that exists, that sees women as being inherently of less or even no value whatsoever. Because on the one hand, while these media images of these women are very familiar to us, what is also familiar to us is the reality, as we see in the next slide, Nikhilesh, please, where we know that in India, every minute, thousands of females who are not even born are put to death, or they are married off, or they die of malnutrition. They suffer from stunting. If you look at the UNICEF reports on children from the age of 0 to 5, it is terrible just to see the statistics and the photographs of the children, and naturally most of them girl children, who suffer from various kinds of malnutrition and the results of that malnutrition. We see that 1/3 of all child brides in the world are from India. So they're married off without their consent. They're sexualized before they're, even actually properly women. They have no say in the matter, and they are seen as burdens in most cases. And it's not just, we sometimes think, oh, that doesn't happen here. But if we look at the child marriage situation, in West Bengal is one of the worst, that if we look at the numbers of child marriages that happen in India. So it's something which is close to us. It is perhaps closer than the success that is achieved by individual women. And we see that, that this is everywhere around us. It's happening all the time. So, and if we want to take comfort by saying, well, that's because, these are happening in the non-educated areas of India, once we get people educated, then things will be better. We'll see how things, it will improve over time. But no, let us look at higher education, because I think most of the people with us today are in the realm of higher education. And these are all, I'm not sure whether you can see this, but these are all Government of India MHRD statistics. They show that typically the women who participate in large numbers in higher education today, but when we find that if we look at the total number of academics, people who are researchers or teaching, we find that 65% almost are male, and only 35%, little more than that, are women. But if we look at the enrollment statistics, we find that it is almost the same nowadays in many fields, streams in higher education in India. That women and men are enrolling in almost the same numbers. But when we come to the profession, this is what we see. The higher up we go up the ladder in higher education, if you look at the one on the bottom right, on my screen at least, you find that when if we look at the three sort of comparisons, the one on the right shows that when people join as lecturers or assistant professors, there is a difference which I mentioned about 60-40. But as we go higher up, when we reach the next level of associate professor, we see the gap getting wider. And by the time we reach the professor level, we find the gap is very, very wide. That is reflected in the other table that is there as well, the white table in between. And again, these are all Government of India statistics. There too, we see that if we look at women in leadership positions, whether it's deans, the three leadership positions they have identified are deans, registrars, and vice chancellors or directors. Again, we look at the numbers here. It is quite astounding that, for example, none of the IITs have any women anywhere in any position of responsibility. If we look at the, the central universities, the deemed universities, the state universities, the private universities, it's all the same, that women are hardly represented in any of these positions, and we find no women anywhere there. So what happens? Just to digress a little bit, I recently went to a meeting of state bank officers to talk about and discuss with them some of the issues that they are facing regarding gender. And one thing that they mentioned was that women don't want to take promotions, that when we promote them, they don't want to accept the promotions. So we'd like to talk about that. And so the women who have refused promotions, who prefer to stay in a low-end job, they say that, of course, there's the issue of family, that it is assumed that the whole responsibility of the family will be on me. And if you're a manager, you cannot leave the branch until the last, everything is done. So you can be there till 8 o'clock, 8:30, if there's some problem, 9 o'clock. And then how can I look after my children? How can I look after my in-laws, etc.? So that is there. Also, many of them also raise other interesting points. They said that if I'm transferred, I could go to a village. In a village, it's very difficult for a woman living alone to even get a flat or a place to stay. They say that even if I tell them that I'm married, my family is in Calcutta, even then, many of them said that we've had this kind of an experience where we didn't get a place to rent because somehow nobody wants to give a house to a single woman living alone. Whether she's single or not is a different issue, but a woman who is living alone. And they were also talking about possible solutions to this. Maybe State Bank should rent a flat so that all officers could stay there, or things like that. But I found it quite telling that we find women do not want to take up. So, it's not just that women are not there at the higher levels in higher education or in any profession, perhaps, but also there's a sense that women are unwilling to take up responsibility. So it is not that women cannot achieve. This whole thing about positive thinking and confidence will get you to achieve anything is not really the whole story. And what I really want to concentrate on is the idea of, Nikhilesh, if you can go to the next slide, the idea of what is being called nowadays the structural inequality, and the way in which structural inequality is something that, the next slide, please, Nikhilesh, what we find in structural inequality is that these inequalities are not just about one individual thing, that this is an opportunity that I am not getting, or this is an opportunity that I am being deprived of, but it is a whole system in which the inequality is deeply woven into the very fabric of a society. So they are not just in one particular institution. This imbalance of power is in every sphere of our life. It is in the political, the economic, the cultural, the social, in every sphere in which we have based our identities on. There is a set of rules which says that women are not equal to men, and that is ingrained in our very society itself, which means that there is limited access to wealth, resources, anything. There is limited ability to take decisions for yourself. Then these are reflected in every sphere of our public and private life. So it's not just about the institutions out there. Even our intimacies, even the most intimate moments that we have as individuals are also part of this larger fabric of society. And therefore, what we find is that our identities themselves and how people interact with our identities is determined by all these factors around us, of which we are also part. Our public, private, every part of our life is affected by the way in which these inequalities are very much structured into our society. They are part of the way in which society is structured. And one way in which we see that is that the laws have been set up. Both the legal systems and the social systems have been set up by those in power. So what we find is that, no, can we just not right?
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
No, it's okay. We can sort of go there. So what we see is that the law, both the legal system and the social cultural systems within which we live, are both set up and determined by the ones in power. Now, I did want to talk specifically about the digital world today, because I remember when the whole idea of the internet, I mean, we are of that generation which, in a way, sort of saw the birth and the development of the internet. And when the internet, it wasn't called internet, of course, in those days, came into being, many of us thought that this was going to be a brave new world. This was a world where everyone would be equal, where these structural inequalities could be dealt with, because this is all digital, it's all out there. There's no physical identity caught up with the way in which I am seen or I interact. It is all virtual, and therefore this is a world which has the possibility of recreating the world as we know it. And many of us were all very we're all very hopeful and all very optimistic about the way that the digital world would be able to make a difference and would be able to maybe remove the kind of inequalities that we see in the real world, in the actual world around us. And we see that that today the internet has grown and grown and grown. And in India, the slide that came, that the Supreme Court of India has indeed has ruled that the access to internet is a fundamental right. So in a way, this whole idea of the digital world is a different kind of structure within which we all hoped something would change. But what did we find? We found that the structural inequalities that remain in the real world are just being reflected in the world of the internet as well. In the slide that you see in front of you now, this is a very basic statistic showing the way in which gender, the gender differentiation between internet access, the internet usage. And of course, we see that countries where structural inequalities are less show a smaller gender gap, and the countries or the regions where the gender inequality is greater, we find the gender inequality, the gender difference in internet usage is also greater. So basically we find that similar kinds of trends are reflected in the way in which people are accessing the digital world, let alone using it. We'll come to that later. If we here, I couldn't get them. I mean, you can sort of make out the numbers, but just to reiterate some of the numbers, that in the Americas, that is both North and South America, the difference is barely about less than 1% between male and female, whereas it grows in the Asia Pacific region, to which we belong, to become almost a 15% difference between the men and the women. But we must remember that this arena also includes China, where actually gender access to internet and the digital world is exactly the same. There's no difference. I mean, it reflects the gender constituents of the actual world. So China does not show any gender difference. And similarly, Australia also does not show any difference. So this area does include these countries where the internet access does not show any gender difference at all, but it also includes India. In studies that the Indian government has done, they show that in India, the internet users can be divided roughly to find that the internet users are 60% male and 40% female. Okay, just yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So so it's a 60-40 division. So the gender gap is 20%, and that's for India itself. But again, when we look at what is happening on the internet, what is happening in this world, we find that in many ways, perhaps the way in which the digital world is actually going on may actually be as bad, if not worse, than the actual world in which we live. These cartoons, I hope you can read them. These cartoons are part of a report which was commissioned by the Amnesty International, which studied Twitter feeds to women politicians during the last general elections in India in 2016, no, 18, whatever. And it studied the way in which Twitter was being used. And what they found was that the amount of gender and sexual related abusive or problematic, as they call it, tweets to women was much, much higher than those received by men. men politicians. They were looking at the candidates in each constituency, and they were comparing the kind of tweets received by these women candidates as compared to the men candidates. And you can see how very, very high the number of misogynic, sexist texts are, abusive texts are, in the case of women politicians. And they said the more prominent the woman, the more number of objectionable tweets she would receive. We go to the next one again. There's a whole report on this on their website, and you can see that they also compared it to the same kind of abuse, online abuse in other countries, and it is much, much more in India. And of course, it's not only gender, but caste also, and women of different castes, marginalized castes, were particularly badly affected by this. And we know that this is not just about women politicians. This is women across all professions have been receiving these kind of abusive. I'll just, name some of the people who have gone off Twitter after publicly declaring that Twitter has been really affecting their mental health. People like the journalist Birpara and Shagorika Ghosh, writers like Rana Ayub, activists like Sheila Rashid or Swarab Bhaskar are just a few of the very prominent names. But I know that even at a very local level, our university, as many of you know, have a lot of politicians, politically active students. Again, many of them have shown me, the girl students especially, have shown me these horribly abusive Facebook comments or SMS or WhatsApp that they have received. And this has become a very typical strategy to, as the Amnesty International report says, that it serves to belittle, demean, intimidate, and eventually silence women around, because these women that I just named are women who have left Twitter. So they are having to leave the public sphere because of the kind of threat, the kind of intimidation, and ultimately the kind of, impact that it has on their mental health to leave these public forums and, give up the battle, so to speak. Now, if we think that this is only, this is the entire story, it's not. The other thing that I'd like to, other study that I'd like to refer to is from a book and a series of journals, which is called, the book is called Social Media in South India. And this is an ethnographic study by a researcher called Sriram Venkataraman. And this is published as a book, but there are also journal articles about this, the researcher's experiences of a suburb of Chennai in Tamil Nadu called Panchagrami. And it is very interesting to see the way in which the access to digital world is controlled by the of the women there, are controlled by the male members of the society. You can see here that the mobile phone owned by the mother is mostly treated as a landline, collectively owned by the entire family. It's a shared object. It's not a private cell phone, as opposed to that which is given to the husband or to the son. In all these families, he mentions that the sons of the families are given their own mobile phones, sometimes laptops if they can afford it, and an internet connection. And the daughter is not allowed her own mobile phone. And this is just the beginning of this section, because it ends with this thing that the daughter is not allowed to have a phone of her own until she starts attending college. Now, that's also an interesting story, because he shows that even when these women are going to college, And nowadays, even before the pandemic, of course, a lot of us would send, material over WhatsApp groups or through Gmail or sometimes through Facebook. A lot of people use Facebook. So it's become, all these social media platforms have become part of the educational process. So the girls would be allowed this kind of phone for educational purposes, but they were always told that they had to have a family member, usually an elder brother or an uncle or someone, to also be part of that group. So that person had to be part of all the groups that the girl was enrolled in. So she could not have any private, um, any privacy on her phone. It had to be something that was shared with the male members of the society, who would then ask that, okay, why have you, sent a WhatsApp to so and so, especially if that so and so was male and from a different caste. So there was this kind of constant monitoring of the women who were going to college. And this is just a reflection of the kind of inequalities that exist in the real world being translated into the digital world as well. There's another very interesting study on Wikipedia. Wikipedia, as you all know, I'm sure, is something that is user generated. So theoretically, anyone can upload or edit or strengthen or add to any kind of entry that is there. So there have been several studies on Wikipedia which show, for example, that if you sort of type in something like the Man Booker winners over the last 10 years, you will find articles on all of the winners. But typically, the ones which deal with the male writers are much richer and more substantial, generally speaking, than those on the women. Similarly, if you look at the number of women who have pages in Wikipedia and the number of men who have pages in Wikipedia, it is very clear that the men have many, many more pages. Even when women have been achieving or they've done something, their pages are never as complete and as rich as those of the men, and so on. But also, what is interesting is it's not just the content, but who is it who, if you look at who actually uses Wikipedia, not uses, but who actually enriches Wikipedia by contributing, where there are no bars, where it doesn't matter what your gender is, as long as you give something according to their structure of reference, it will be accepted. There too, it is found that women contribute about 20% of all the postings that go up. So women themselves do not participate in this making of knowledge, in the sense that Wikipedia has become the most frequently used resource. It's the fifth largest website. I mean, it's a website that is fifth in terms of how many people access it every day. So it's a huge source of knowledge. But why then are women not using this to create the knowledge that everyone is using? And there too, there's one very interesting paper which says that women, because of their structurally determined sense of not being adequate, of not being important enough, of not being good enough, actually refrain from expressing themselves as they have the right to, or they have the opportunity to. So it's internalized, this sense of being being not adequate is something that is completely internalized as well. So that even when women are given this kind of a platform, even then we find that it doesn't really work in the way it should, because of the larger structural inequalities that exist. I'd just like to make one other point, and that is that if we can just remember the statement from the website that I quoted, one point that they talk about there is that the nation is proud of them. It says it in very bad English, but basically it says that these women achievers make their nation proud. And it's also interesting that who is it that make the nation proud? We find that in recent times, the number of women who have been accused of being anti-national or not good citizens, a very large number of them have been women. And women, it seems, are particularly, supposed to uphold the virtues of nationhood, of citizenship, which is why it seems that this idea of the good woman is not only about social ideas nowadays, but it's also about ideas about citizenship. That a good woman is somebody who acts according to certain ways in which the nation is now being described. And this whole idea of co-opting certain women into this nationalist discourse, and removing some women as not being good Indian women is also something that maybe if we have time left afterwards, we can talk about that a bit as well. But basically, I think that what we need to do is not, it is important to talk about women's rights, not just in terms of rights, in terms of changing laws, because we have very good laws in place if we look at them. I was just watching a video yesterday, which said that, why do people say that India is a rape capital of the world? Because if we look at statistics, then in fact, Indian women get raped a lot less than women in many other countries, including America, including Brazil, many other countries, that women in India are actually not raped as much or as many times as we tend to see in the propaganda. But what this video failed to also mention is that of the almost 40,000 rapes last year, there was only one conviction for rape. So there's hardly any justice that the women get either. So it's not just about numbers, but it is also about how, if there is a violation of a law, then do we get justice? Does anyone get justice? And then, so it's not just about changing laws. I think it's important that all of us, wherever we are, we need to think about the way in which these structural inequalities work in the real world. We need to be very, very careful, because I think the digital world is one place where maybe we can make a difference. All of us, not just women and men together, can make a difference. It's difficult, of course, because another very interesting statistic that you find is that viewers from India are the largest country-wise who watch pornography online. I mean, of all countries in the world, Indian men are the highest consumers of pornography, both paid and unpaid. So so even the digital world is already sexualized to a certain extent. But I think that it does have the possibilities that are positive as well. But also in the real world, I think we need to look at all of these things. Gender, I haven't talked about caste or creed or many of the other parts of our identity. But also we need to look at the world around us, how we internalize it. I think that many of us also internalize a lot of the things that are existing in society. We need to challenge those. And this is not a fight for only women. This is a fight not about women's rights, I believe. It's a fight about rights for everybody. It's a fight that is for the men, for the, for caste, for masculinity also. That masculinity also is not as it is sometimes portrayed to be. There are many versions of masculinity. Basically, I think we all need to look at and redefine and change the way in which we think about the idea of women's rights as just something which is an agenda which is narrowly focused, but to look at it in a broader setup where the fight is not just for women's rights, It's for everybody's right. It is for all of us to make the world a better place, irrespective of gender, caste, creed, race, whatever. And we have to all be in this together. And we need to look at this in a, I think, in a very, very immediate way. Because I think another statistic that is being thrown up is the rise in domestic violence against women the world over, in India especially, and how it's not, every situation just seems to make things worse. And for women and for those who do not enjoy the power of in society, the powerful positions in society. And I don't think that, this is something that we should accept. The one good thing perhaps that can come out of this pandemic is that we are rethinking our values and our social values and what we want in the future. And I think that this is probably a good time for us to come together and try to redefine the future that we want to share with our friends, with our relatives, with our families, with our children. And all of us try to work wherever we are, because this is everywhere, to make the world a better place. Which is why I thank the organizers for allowing me to sort of rave and rant about this for a while. And I'm not sure whether this was useful to anybody, but it gave me an opportunity to express many of the frustrations and the anger that I feel every time any of this happens all around us. So thank you, Nikhilesh and Vishwajit and all the other people involved in this.
Thank you so much, Professor Nilanjana. I think, in fact, your raving and ranting has interested a lot of people. We have also received some questions, and one of the questions is sort of linked to what you said. During this pandemic, domestic violence, there is this fear. There is not enough record, but there is a fear that domestic violence has probably gone up, particularly against women. And there is one question from Ujjwal Bhui, one of the participants, whether women empowerment, whether it can sort of start from the family itself. Just your views on that.
I think that the family, because we are all part of a family in some way or the other, that the family has to be part of this change. When we see, for example, the women I was talking about in the state bank branches, they will always say that the family responsibilities are theirs, that all the family responsibilities have to be taken up by them. When we look at, if you read, there's a whole book which is called Ilieva, which is about women scientists in India. Again, it's published by the government of India. And very, very distinguished women scientists are interviewed there. Almost all of them say that I could become what I did because of the support of my family. They all say that. Even the women who are part of the ISRO team, many of them in their interviews, they talk about how their families, their in-laws, their parents, their husbands were very much part of the way in which they were allowed. Again, the word allowed is interesting, but the way in which they were allowed to take up their career so seriously. So I think that the family is one of the basic sites where, every one of us can make a difference. And it's not just about women. I think that, families and the way in which families are structured also put an immense amount of pressure on the men. I know a lot of young males, for example, whether they're my students or, I work with a lot of adolescent girls and boys outside the university as well. And it's not just women who are anxious about their futures. The male adolescents are told that, we are told from our childhood that it's your responsibility to get a job. You have to support the family. You have a role to play. We are all depending on you. And so that we can't explore, we can't explore what we want to explore. We have to think about what our family needs are and so on. So, this whole way in which the family is especially in India, where the family structures are still very strong, the way in which, gender determines certain roles in the family is part of this structural problem as well. So I think the family is a very, very important place to begin. Um, you know, I'm not sure whether it's the epicenter, but it's a very important place.
Right. And as people from the discipline of literature, Pooja Mine has asked a question. Ma'am, can you please talk about literature's role in minimizing the gender gap in India and gender discrimination, if it at all plays a role?
I think it plays a very important role, not only literature, but any kind of cultural product. If we look at films, for example, or even, I had, there's a student of mine who was working on memes, for example. That was fantastic because Indian memes are often so very sexist and terrible that, just looking at some of those should be interesting in itself. But anyway, no, literature or any other cultural product, I think, is particularly important in the way in which it can be used, I think, in two ways. One is to, first of all, make us more familiar with the issues that often we don't know what is happening. I'm sort of, born and brought up in a particular kind of context. I don't know what's happening elsewhere. So I get to know a lot. So that's the first thing, that I get to know a lot about things that are happening everywhere in the world, whether it's Palestinian women, or whether it's what's happening in Turkey. If I read Orhan Pamuk, I get to know the whole sort of debate between Islamic fundamentalism, women's rights, all of that. So I get to know what's happening in the world. Definitely, that's one thing. And secondly, I think that for a lot of readers, literature becomes the place where we actually begin to explore ideas for the first time, especially as students. That there are many ideas that are given to us within literature, many ways of thinking, many thoughts, many philosophies. And I think that is very, very important. The more we read, the more we watch, films from other places, we are also learning and being exposed to a variety of points of view. Just as we say, traveling is good for us because we get to know so much about other societies. Literature, I think, literature or culture is, sitting at home, I can explore these other ways of thinking, not just another place, but how do people think? Well, I've never thought like this. For me personally, also, I think culture was one place which really began as, as a schoolgirl, reading novels, reading books, was one place where I began to think about, things are not always what, my family tells me. There is another alternative. My family is pretty conservative. None of the women worked. All my aunts were quite well educated, but none of them had any job. So it was like, it was literature that made me feel that, okay, there is something else that is possible. So I think that's also important, that it opens up our ways of thinking. It opens up our imaginations for ourselves and for the society around us.
Thank you, Nilanjana. We are just running a little behind schedule, so we'll keep the rest of the questions for the end of today's sessions. Thank you so much. And I will now move on to the second presentation. Our second speaker today is Dr. Gabriela Ilieva, clinical professor at the is the recipient of the President's Award in India for her contribution to the spread of Hindi in the United States and beyond. Today, Dr. Ilieva will talk about decoding gender in Rig Veda and other texts. Thank you, Gabriela ji, for joining us today, and it's over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers. It's an honor to participate in this highly important and challenging conversation about gender. It is always very difficult to separate politics from it, and I will try to do it as much as I can. It's just this was a really good segue for me to move from sort of a social and sociological perspective on gender, and use literature now to go into another perspective, which is more stylistical or more even, we can call it grammatical, because the way we talk about gender is sort of something that we need to think about how our language encodes our own stereotypes and our beliefs, and how we become even more responsible nowadays when we talk about gender, because we know better now how we embed our stereotypes. So when Dr. Gupta mentioned nation and woman, that reminded me of a sign that I used to see a lot, and even today on the streets of Delhi in particular. I'm sorry, I have never been in West Bengal, and I hope I will visit soon. But I used to see Rashtra Samman, Stri Samman on the streets. And that really bothered me. And it was many, many years ago when they started this type of campaign. And this kind of politicization of how we talk about gender is what we want to avoid. But we also want to make sure that when politicians tell us, let us go back to the norms and to the equalities and to the cultural perspectives about gender and women, as they existed in the Vedic times, that made me think, wow, do we really have such an egalitarian society, or do we misinterpret what is, and let's say, only in the Rig Veda? So I will share with you my screen, and I want to show you a particular type of way to look at certain, just give me a second, a particular way of thinking about a text and how we read the text. So when we talk about textual interpretation with interest in gender, we're thinking of how do we discern the patterns of gender indexing, how do we discuss ways of encoding gender information, how do we interpret gender roles and domains through close reading, and how do we reveal embedded gender stereotypes, with making sure that we have a very clear understanding of who the composers are, who the authors are, because not always what is represented in a particular text is generalizable enough for the whole society or even for the whole historical period. So in this case, when we're talking about the Rig Veda, or later on I will mention only the Poetics, we have to be clear that we're not talking about a socially accepted stereotype that is reflected in an author's text, but that is the author's perception, the author's understanding of these stereotypes. So the methodology that I'm using for textual analysis is the frequency of references to men and women. How many times are women referred to in texts that deal not necessarily explicitly or with focus on gender? We look at the context when these references are made, or the kind of representations that are made explicitly, men versus women. We look also at the centrality versus the marginality of the themes related to the representations of men and women. We look at the lexical choices, including the collocations, and then we look at grammatical rhetorical aspects. There are, of course, some challenges if we're dealing with an ancient text. And these challenges are related to, one, the antiquity of the texts, the type of elusiveness and obscurity, because the texts were created by the gods, used by men for the gods during particular ritualistic events. With references to events or things that, or narratives that were common knowledge between those specific ritual experts and the gods. So commoners were not supposed to understand, were not supposed to be a part of these kind of events. And of course, therefore, these narratives or events that are referenced, they were not explicit, they were just implicitly there. Then there is the challenge of how much of an aesthetic function had these texts encode, and how much religious value did they have. If the texts are not sociological research, can we claim that we can find gender encoding there? Another challenge is the entirety of the texts, or are these the only texts from that particular historical period that were found? And then, of course, we're talking about social homogeneity versus complexity. And Dr. Gupta also had mentioned about how a family does not represent a society. When you say a society, there are so many layers in the society that we always have to keep in mind that we are always talking about a slice, about the window over something that is much deeper than this. Yet it doesn't mean that those kind of challenges will be sort of considered impediment to potential interpretation with attention to gender. We also, in the challenges, once we start looking at the texts, we find that the centrality of the themes versus the marginality of the themes becomes a challenge. Why? Because when a particular theme within which a particular representation is contexted, is examined, then that theme, if central, provides much more information, much deeper and richer context. Whereas if marginally we find representations because the themes are marginal themselves, then we have less context and less depth for possible analysis. And again, as I mentioned, the poet's perspective is also extremely important to consider and never forget that the poets did not represent the whole society. Now, just to make sure, of course, the discourse, the discussion so far during this event covered gender roles. The way I'm using gender roles is very similar, social roles mediated through gender. And what I'm interested also is the involvement in specific domains. As Dr. Gupta also did, she went over different domains of social activity that women are involved, and she did some statistical comparison. With us, the statistical comparison will be in terms of what we find, how many times it's mentioned, and we're gonna look at the volume. These domains we define as institutionalized portion of socially constructed experiences with discrete sectors of social life. So when we're talking about the Vedic time, we can talk with confidence about maybe three main domains. The public one, where we have the warfare, the kinship, the agriculture, the whole social relations, the outside of home places where they are conducted, versus the private domain, which is the marriage, where the reproduction, parenthood, and all these themes are being talked about. Then we have the second realm, or the second main domain, mundane versus divine, and this is, of course, the separation or the distinction between where the mortals and the immortals live. And then there is this middle domain that we feel needs to be there separately because of its meaning and of its purpose and of its importance to the Vedic times, which is the ritual, where this is the sacrificial domain, which is almost as rich as the social or the public or the private domain. So when we move on to the idea of sacrifice, I'm giving you here a definition of Professor Smith: a constructive activity creating the human being, the afterlife, and the cosmos as a whole. And its goal was to activate the connections that bind the ritual world to the world, or the world at large. The female figure in the Rig Veda is mentioned in many cases, and we will examine the possible contexts in which these the references are made, which is female figures are mentioned as mothers, as wives, as widows, and daughters. They are also mentioned in a relationship with another male, as the daughter with the father and the mother with the son. Interesting, the mother and the son, when using the Sanskrit word for son in reference or in relation to the mother, the word putra is used, but not sunu. Whereas when the father is being mentioned with the son, then sunu is used. So it's an interesting differentiation that requires additional, based on etymology type of interpretation. Less often we have mentions of patni, which is interesting, that in terms of kinship, the mother, the wife, the widow, the daughter are the more referenced one than the patni. And then, of course, we have this kind of independent status where the maiden, the Yosha, the Yoshana, the Yuvati, the Kumari, or just Nari, Stri, Jarini is mentioned. And we have implicit or explicit use in relation to a male in many cases throughout the hymns of the Rig Veda. We also have interesting similes. Maiden going to the rendezvous, she goes, she smiles, she is open, she's shining. And then we also have young women who are dressing up or are making themselves beautiful using transitive verbs, but on themselves, so where they are the object. And then we have different actions in different similes that are involving married women in several hymns. The vach is likened to the woman who is a desirous wife, and she's making herself beautiful for her husband. The ushas is compared to the desirous wife possessing beautiful garments, and who again is making herself beautiful or unveils her breast to her husband. The poet compares the preparation of the fire pit for the gods to the desirous wife possessing beautiful garments, who prepares her female organ for her husband. So you can see there is already very clear use of sexual and intercourse related type of thematics. And then there is a wish that the expanding wide ones open themselves as beautifully decorated wives would be a wood for their husbands, and the divine doors, spacious and admitting all, be easily would be easily accessed by the gods. Praises reaching Indra compared to women approaching their men, a parallel between the way the mighty touches the supreme being, and the way loving women touch their loving husbands. And then there is a picture, the wife pulls the husband toward herself. So what we saw so far is a lot of mentioning of women, but mostly in a sexual, mostly mostly from their attractiveness point of view. Male figures also are mentioned in terms of their kinship, but here we find extension or addition, which is members of a social group. They're Rajanas, they're Viras, they're Brahmans. They're also they have professions. They are Pashupan, they are Takshan, they are Muni. So they have their jobs, they have their social belonging, and they also have their family belonging, which we don't find so richly referenced about women. In addition, we can look at the kind of actions, the transitivity, the agency, the context, the themes, the centrality of their actions. And men, of course, are with their spouses when they are in a sacrificial couple type of function. They are always in one state of mind when they're pressing the summer juice. They are the couple that, again, in one state of mind, anoints the well-placed friend, Agni, with milk. They're the couple who are devoted to God. They're the couple that hold the wooden ladle. They're the couple who are desirous of Indra. It seems that when they're in a couple, everything is done together. But the men do independently a lot of rituals where women do not do independently those rituals. And when they are during the sacrifice, they are in full harmony with the actions of the men. In terms of other disproportions, we find this su, which is good affix, added to patni, which means a good wife. But we don't find su pati, which would be a good lord or a good husband. We also find suputra, which means a female having good sons. But we don't find suputra for men because they are suvira. They have good hero sons. So in a way, a mother has sons, but a father has hero sons. And then we have certain interesting verbs that men perform, like enjoy or be delighted or be excited, plus an instrumental case with young women, which we don't find the opposite with women, meaning women do not enjoy or be delighted or be excited by young men. And then what I mentioned already, that men do perform sacrificial and professional actions where we don't find these actions performed by women. But then in the Anukramani, we have a mention of a lot of rishis and a lot of poetesses. Female rishis and a lot of poetesses. And this is used later on by certain politicians to say, oh, well, we have a lot of female poets accepted into the Rig Vedic list of talented authors and poets. Well, if we go deep and if we examine the hymns, then we find that some of these poetesses are not necessarily explicitly mentioned as poetesses, but they are the so-called lyrical voice in the hymn. Gosha is a maiden growing old at home with no father or brother wishing for a husband. It doesn't mean necessarily that she is the poet, but maybe there is a voice expressed in a lyrical, a fictional, a poetical voice expressed in the hymn. And interestingly enough, in both 1039 and 1040, the two hymns where Ghosha's voice is heard, the context in which she positions herself is, again, family, with reference to no brother, no father, and the two hymns are addressing the Ashwins to help her find a husband. Apara is a maiden who is wishing for a husband. Her voice in first person singular again is heard to say that she wants to have her daddy's head, her daddy's fields, and this thing under her navel to sprout, which means that she is either wishing for maturity or she, according to some interpretations, she has some kind of skin problem. So she's praying for cure. the most important point is that she does something that philologists call hapax legomenon, which is there is no other mention of this kind of expression or action in other hymns, which is she chews on the soma plant and offers the extract to Indra. Usually the soma extract is described as gushing between the stones, as very there is a lot of volume produced that is given to Indra, that is offered to Indra in a very solemn way. So here we find this intimacy, this short distance that she creates between Indra and herself. And she even uses diminutive for Indra to kind of create this intimacy with him in order for her not to intimidate, not to challenge maybe the stereotypes that existed, because she's already doing something very unusual to address directly the gods. In addition, we have a mention in the Anukramani, the Vishvavara. However, as a poetess and as a female rishi, however, no other mention in other texts. We find, and it seems that this is just the ladle facing east that is granting all goods. And then the Mugdalani story, we know that her husband was, the legend, the myth is that her husband was injured. They didn't have kids. He was injured on the battlefield, so she raced to the battlefield to save her husband, because her role as a mother had not been yet performed. We also have the type of dialogues between Yamayami, Agastya Lopamudra, Indra Indrani, where again all of them are about some kind of sexually related context and content. Lopamudra, as you know, was growing old at home, and Agastya was keeping his celibacy, but she had to remind him that it is also the type of progeny responsibility that he needs to perform in order for the final rites to be performed at the end, in order for Agastya to move on to the world of the forefathers. Yamayami, of course, they were conceptualized as the primordial beings, brother and sister, and she reminded him that they need to continue the human race. Indra Indrani, a very obscure dialogue that can be read very sexually, again, is about their intimate relationship, where Indrani is complaining by the way she's being treated. So in other words, even in those hymns where we have a female voice expressing first-person singular type of prayer, or in dialogues between a male and a female character, the domains, the themes, and the type of actions that are referred to for females to engage in are still different, more limited than everything else we find about men. Parenthood is also an interesting line, an interesting venue to examine. Mothers are described to protect, to cover, to feed their young sons. And it seems that they are in relationship with the baby because they are using their the edge of their dress, of their cloth, of their dressing to cover the son is in their hands or in their lap. So it seems that it's more the mother in relationship to the young baby. And also interesting that there is no mother to daughter reference, or daughter to daughter, or female to female kind of interaction being represented in the hymns, or mentioned or referenced in the hymns. And then on the other hand, you have the father who grabs the son by the hand, who leads, who instructs the son. So it seems that the father has a relationship with their child at a later stage. which is also an interesting differentiation in the representations, and a kind of disproportionate, again, representation. Moving on from the Rig Veda, and I know I have limited the amount of time, I also was interested in examining the Naika and the Nayak kind of description, and how possibly in poetry, the perpetuation of certain disproportions that are gender-based is a part of the sort of the production, and how this perpetuation is sort of takes place is something that we need to be aware of even today, in terms of how we refer to and describe men and women. Dr. Gupta, very interesting, mentioned the political Twitter and political references to female public figures. It is interesting that the way they look, the way they dress, the way they behave is far more interesting than what they do actually, and what their achievements are. So if we look back to the poetic gurus, the poetic theoreticians, what we find is that they make references as when they write their manuals for poetry writing, when they give the examples for poetry writing, where women are described with their eyes, their eyebrows, their breasts, their thighs, many more times than men. And then men are described with their feet, with their wrists, and their hearts. I am very interested in these kind of volume-based references, because it almost seems that men do not have eyes, eyebrows, and breasts and thighs, and women do not have hearts or feet or wrists. So in terms of the number of references. And then, of course, women are mentioned as being in love and being angry and being enchanted, where men are all these plus many more mentions in terms of their social and their professional lives. So this kind of analysis that I quickly went over gives us a very good idea of how language embeds and codes gender stereotypes, how women are referred to with less vocabulary and less variety of grammatical rhetorical features, how the main themes are their sexuality and fertility, how the topic marginality is sort of very obvious, because they're mostly mentioned as extended similes, especially in the Rig Veda, or their beauty is likened to or used in metaphors, also in poetry as well, in other poetry as well. And then the personal and domestic domains are very clear, and roles, it's very clear that their roles are mostly defined based on their biological attributes. Whereas men, of course, we know, have all this, sometimes less in terms of volume and less restricted in terms of detail, and yet the main themes are there, the main centrality. In terms of their physical appearance is limited, as it is for women. However, the centrality of what they do, of how they behave, and the public domains that they're involved in is much deeper. Thank you. I hope that was sort of a way for us to look differently at what information this rich literature brings to us, and how a contemporary framework can be used for us for contemporary purposes was enlightening. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ilieva. And in fact, your presentation has been listened to and seen very carefully by a lot of our participants who have some questions as well. Vishwajit Dash asks a question. The decoding of gender in the scriptures offers because they came from a patriarchal pen. So what would happen if the poet of the scriptures were a female one? As you said, I mean, some of these inequalities are probably embedded in the language itself. Would it have mattered if it was a woman writing?
This question, it's very speculative because nothing has come down to us in this genre from a woman's pen, or it is not a pen because there was no script until maybe 4th century BC, and the hymns were composed and orally transmitted through this unbelievable tradition, mnemonic tradition. So the female authorship, we don't know what it would have created for us. However, let's think about folk songs and folk literature. We know that there is a lot of female voices in female authored folk songs. We can examine whether there is a difference between what they create as a world about themselves and what the male created ones create about women and themselves. And we can see that there is still a little bit of limiting thematics and context in terms of family, in terms of love, in terms of sexuality, that in male songs we find, but it is not necessarily as central as it is in the female authored ones. And also we have more depth and more span of social activities that men reflect on in their own songs.
Thank you. There is another question from Shohini Mukherjee. Shohini Mukherjee asks, is there anything in the Rig Veda about women's education?
Education is a term that we need to be very clearly aware that we are thinking of it in very Western ways, in very Western traditional ways. Education was something different at that time, and there isn't. But at the same time, there isn't about men either. So there is this tradition of being instructed by the forefathers, by the fathers, by the gods, which we could call education. There is in Manu's laws and in later literature, there is the Upanayana sort of tradition and ritual, which was, again, it existed for women, but it was called this way, although it was performed differently for women. So there are references to sort of some kind of education for women, however, again, in more limited terms, and again, in more exceptional terms. So we want to make sure that we are always aware that there are exceptions, as we have in India and in South Asia, our prime ministers in numbers and politicians in numbers that do not exist necessarily in the same way, in the same numbers in the Western world. But we need to be very careful of thinking, oh, but there is the family behind, there is the dynasty behind. Would they have achieved the same if they were independent of their family? So again, sheer numbers of references are less in terms of education. There are, but we also have to think about what kind of exactly education was meant and how it was performed, whether it was different between men and women.
Right. Thank you. And there are two questions which are probably related. One is by Shubham Bhattacharya, and he asks, are the Vedas discriminatory towards women and lower caste people? And connected to this is another question which is written by someone with the username Kothar Khoje. He or she says, do you think that the Vedas have the solution to gender
What I would say is discrimination is an active approach to an active attitude against someone or something. Discrimination is a very strong word because when we think about the realm of Rig Veda, it is already between the mortals and the immortals. We don't want to. Discrimination is a term that has judgment, that has criticism, that has some kind of awareness that it needs to be fixed. Discrimination is not, in my mind, relevant as a term to the Rig Veda. Yes, there are far less mentions of women and women's issues, but that wasn't the purpose of the texts. And we need to be very sensitive to the real objective of these texts. These texts were created by gods for those who believe in gods. They were transmitted to those who were appointed, chosen because of who they were, to be remembered. And then they were chanted only during very sophisticated and detailed ritual events. Discrimination is something that we should talk nowadays, and how through language we might inadvertently discriminate by describing a woman politician by what she wears, or by describing women as the nation, because they are not the only members of this nation, and they are referred to as the nation usually in the discourse created by men. So these are the things I think that are the useful way of looking at in an ancient text, rather than going all the way with the newly sort of accumulated vocabulary in terms of gender discrimination.
Thank you so much. I think that answers the questions. And of course, there will be other questions which come to the mind of the participants. I mean, I think that's the idea of a webinar, to generate those questions. So I think, I'm also asking the others who are backstage that whether we conclude the presentation and go on to the vote of thanks. Then would you please speak up? And thank you, Professor Ilieva,
Thank you so
for your
much.
presentation. There were a lot of unanswered questions from Nilanjana's session as well. Bishwajitda, if you are online, would you do we go into any of those questions? Okay, so in that case, what we will do is we can, of course, continue the discussion in other means, but I will now request Dr. Dilkumar Pradhan, the teacher in charge of Birpara College, to please deliver the vote of thanks for today.
Thank you, Dr. Nilesh Bhattacharya. On behalf of the organizer, I would first like to thank our two speakers today, Professor Nilanjana Gupta of Jadavpur University and Gabriela Ilieva of New York University for taking time off their busy schedule to be a part of our initiative. This international webinar could not have taken place without the consent encouragement of Dr. Jayanta Mukherjee, principal of Acharya Sukumar Mahavidyalaya, Purba Bardhaman. We thank him for his support. I would like to thank the conveners, Dr. Pritesh Chakravarti, the IQAC coordinator at Acharya Sukumar Mahavidyalaya, and Nilesh Bhattacharya, his counterpart at Birpara College, for their untiring effort in organizing this webinar. I also take this opportunity to thank our former colleague, Dr. Bishwajit Panda of Department of Bengali, Acharya Sukumar Sen Mahavidyalaya, who is the bridge between our two colleges, as well as Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir, Belur, who have kindly provided us with platform for this international webinar through its educational and cultural station. A special thanks are due to Sri Ramakrishna Mandal of ECS for managing all the technical aspect of this session. To conclude, I thank all the participants who have been with us through today's session. Please visit the same YouTube live page tomorrow at 3 p.m. to take part in the second day of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pradhan, for your vote of thanks. That concludes the first day of this webinar. The second day will be streamed in the same way on YouTube Live. And special thanks to the Educational and Cultural Station for allowing us this platform. Thank you, Nilanjana Di. Thank you, everyone else who was here. And with this, we conclude our session today. Thank you.